I love you, but every time you come over, your addiction is with you. Sometimes I've had families even name their loved one's addiction. I had a family name their son's addiction the intruder. And so they would say, every time you come over, the intruder's with you. We don't want your intruder. We want you, but this intruder keeps coming over, and we've got to figure out a way to make sure that this doesn't happen. We don't want that in our house.
So you just found out your loved one is abusing drugs or alcohol. What do you do now? Coming up, we're going to hear from Suzanne Brown, the clinical director at Midwest Recovery Centers, somebody I have the pleasure of working with. She is the resident expert on everything from substance abuse to setting boundaries to caring in balance to detaching with love. She is going to go through a whole host of questions and answering them so that you and your family can understand the best way to help navigate family recovery. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Finding Mental Wellness. I am your host, Taylor Brown. And today we are going to be focusing on navigating family recovery. And we're going to have the pleasure of speaking with Suzanne Brown, the clinical director here at Midwest Recovery Centers. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know that the listeners are going to be really excited to hear from somebody clinically inclined and doing this on a regular basis. You have a ton of practical real world experience. And from what I know, you have personal experience as well. And I am excited for our viewers and listeners to be able to experience that from you and hear a little bit about that. So if it's all right with you, I wanted to start off by tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your personal experience with addiction.
Well, so it's hard to know where to begin because I have so much experience with addiction, which
Right.
luckily I'm now grateful for. I can't tell you I've always been grateful for it, but I grew up in a home where alcoholism was present. I remember being early teens when my mom sort of sat down with my sister and I and let us know that my dad was struggling with alcoholism.
Mm.
Obviously, I didn't know what that meant, but my mom is an amazing woman, and she enrolled my twin sister and I in a program that helped teach us about what alcoholism is, things to look out for, how to take care of ourselves. I remember learning at a really young age that I had a 1 in 4 chance of becoming an alcoholic. That was
Wow.
maybe yeah, that was my probably one takeaway. Also, that it wasn't my fault. That was really important as a child to
Yeah.
know. Um,
Did your
but
mom,
yeah,
if I can interrupt, did your mom, how come she had the instinct to know to look into education herself and for you kids? Like, where did that come from?
honestly, I don't know. I don't know because there
Maybe
was not
motherly
real
instinct or,
motherly instincts, I guess. Because we don't have any other really addiction in our family. So I think just being the amazing woman she was, she probably went to work and trying to find something. And she found support groups for herself and my dad's sisters, so my aunts, and then, us kids, which at the time I didn't realize how helpful it would become because not only did it help me in the moment understanding my dad's addiction and what he was going through, and that it was an illness, but also to know that sort of information when it became time for me to get help. And ultimately, there was that time. I have the genetic predisposition to become an addict, and I certainly did. So it didn't
mm,
keep me from the genetics that were kind of set up for me. I started drinking and I started drinking pretty alcoholically from the beginning. I remember thinking to myself, this is the answer to all my problems, and I just need to do this more often. And obviously, that's not the answer. Um, so when I was 22, I got sober. And I do believe that the education that I received from that class really helped me to understand things to look out for, like withdrawal symptoms. I can't tell you any other 18-year-old that would have been able to identify.
Yeah.
that they were having withdrawal symptoms. Like,
Sure,
I
yeah,
think,
shaky
you know
hands, yeah.
yeah, shaky hands, and I think other people might be like, "Oh, I'm dehydrated," or "I
Sure.
didn't have enough to eat today," and I was like, yeah, I think I drank too much and got blacked out last night."
You're like, "I
So,
know what this means. I
yes.
did enough classes to know what that means." Now, let me ask
Yeah.
you, so that's so interesting that you caught it so early. I mean, that's a blessing, right? But I wonder when you were beginning, like we were talking with Kevin on the first episode, and I asked him, like, when your dad was drinking and using and you started to dabble in that, were there any alarm bells or red flags? And I would ask the same thing of you. Did any part of you think I maybe ought to not do this, or perhaps I could go down the same road as dad? Or was it just seemed like innocence of just trying things and it just wasn't in your mind until it became a problem?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because there was that piece of me saying, "Oh, I'm not going to drink. I'm never going to put alcohol into my body." Like, I did have that sort of promise to myself, and I kept it longer than a lot of people. I didn't start drinking until I was close to 17 years old, which nowadays is kind of crazy. And so I think that was helpful. But when I did start drinking, immediately all of the judgment and reasoning, any part of my prefrontal cortex that was formed was like out the window. I mean, I overrode it, and that reward system went into like full gear. And I think just the reward of that like hit of dopamine, or that feeling, the euphoria I got from drinking and maybe using some other drugs, outweighed any sort of resolve that I had around not drinking. But I did
Right.
have the delusion that I was going to be able to control it because I knew about addiction. I knew what to look out for. So I was going to be different than my dad. You know, I was going to have control over it.
That prompts me to ask another follow-up question of you, Suzanne. I've heard you discuss this many times with panel events for families. I've borrowed it many times. I hope that's all right. You've talked about how the brain starts to change when you start to feed it, substances, right? And you talk about how that changes the reward system and how the brain functions. And you kind of touched on something that made me think about that. I think you know what I'm talking about when I mention that, like when you start to boost the serotonin with substances and how it can change the way the brain kind of fires and how somebody's behavior is motivated. Would you mind touching on some of that a little bit?
Yeah, I will give a disclaimer that I'm not a medical person, I'm not a science person, I am a social worker, and so the best way for me to understand it is in lay terms, in terms that other people can understand.
Hmm.
Um, Basically what happens is when we put drugs into our body, we are sort of mimicking neurotransmitters, and what these neurotransmitters do is, they're responsible for chemicals that fire in our brains. And so, I might be boosting endorphins or mimicking the boost of endorphins or the boost of dopamine. And so, um, my body or my brain starts to get confused when I start to put different drugs into my body. And over time, what happens is it becomes so used to me doing it instead of doing it itself. Like the our bodies are very efficient. They know when they're doing too much work. And so my brain is sending a signal like we don't have to produce this dopamine anymore because she keeps altering it. She keeps putting these drugs or alcohol into her body, and so we don't need to do this anymore. So the analogy that I like to give is if I was, driving in the car and my we'll say Spotify, I used to say radio, but Spotify is more relevant. My Spotify comes on and it's blaring loud. M- what would I do?
Turn it down, probably.
Yeah, I would turn it down. And so what our brain does is it recognizes that we are sending all of these signals to produce this dopamine, and it says, "You know what? I'm going to stop sending this signal." So what it does is it turns down the volume on our production of feel good chemicals. And so now what used to be something that would cause me euphoria, now maybe gives me a little euphoria, but more than anything, it levels me out. So now I need that because my brain has stopped
You
working
set a
so
new
hard.
baseline. You set a new
Yes,
baseline to
the
get to.
baseline is different.
Gotcha.
Yes, and
Okay.
so when people try to stop, at least for me, when I stopped drinking, I was extremely depressed, and it's because my brain had to figure out how to work again. Um,
Mm.
and a lot of people don't understand that that takes time. And so if they didn't have that understanding, they might say, well, my life is depressing without alcohol. I don't feel
Mhm.
good. And so
Right.
I must need this. And in part, that's kind of true, but our brains will adapt and will learn how to get those neurotransmitters functioning again and all of that. It just takes time.
Right, right. Yeah, and I know that we see that a lot in the admissions department, right? We get a lot of folks that are calling in struggling with, let's say, alcohol use disorder is what we would call it. And they're like, "I'm just depressed all the time. I don't wanna get out of bed," or, "I'm feeling so anxious." And we all I know from personal experience and from working in this field and being around people much smarter than me, like yourself and Shay, and learning about the cyclical nature of addiction and kind of feeding that to yourself can be anxiety inducing. And also alcohol, not to mention it's a depressant, right, on the central nervous system, so it's kind of throwing things out of whack. But that seems to be a common pain point for people when they call in is their or the family. They're like, "Well, maybe Johnny is depressed. I don't know if it's alcohol," right? And they're desperate to find an answer. They really want to know, "Well, I think he's only doing this because he was depressed." And what I typically tell them, what you taught me is that if you can rid the body and the brain of those additional substances, right, then you can get a natural baseline. You talk about that a lot. If people are drinking or using, you would like them to detox first before you and your team can understand if a real look into their brain and how it fires and if they do need mental health or if there is an underlying disorder there. Is you want to share just briefly on that?
Yeah, typically we won't even do psychiatric evaluations for several weeks because people, when they're detoxing, their brain chemistry is so out of whack.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, a lot of times people come in and they are depressed and they are anxious. And a lot of that is just because they have altered their brain chemistry so much. And we don't know what's going on unless they tell us that they have a history of mental illness that
Mhm.
started long before they started using, then we don't really know. And we just have to kind of wait and care for them and see sort of how they do.
We're playing detective essentially, right? Like I tell the
Yeah.
admission team, I said, "You're being a detective, and the more information you can gather, the more prepared clinical and medical will be once they have that individual in front of them and they can see how they're actually operating day to day. So the more information we have, the better. Because you're right, and that's one of the things I love about Midwest is that, and I got to experience it firsthand as a patient. We are truly client centered, right? And that's a buzzword that a lot of places say, but I think you and I know that it's true, right? We are extremely client centered. That's what guides your work, your team on how they build treatment plans.
Yeah.
So, well, let's get to the next topic. And this is kind of a big debate, right? There's still a lot of stigma. And as unfortunate as it is, I like to be honest with our listeners and our viewers that there still is a stigma out there, right? On is addiction a disease or is it a series of poor choices? Is it a moral failing? And as much as we know the American Medical Association has deemed it a disease, there are still many individuals, I mean, some doctors that, have a bit of an attitude with folks that go into the emergency room. It's true, right? And we hear it a lot, but what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. It is deemed a disease by the American Medical Association. We know that a lot of insurance companies will cover treatment and that legitimizes it as a disease, but there are still a lot of people, a surprising amount, who don't believe that it is a disease. And so is it a disease or is it a series of life choices? I mean, the answer is both. But I also
Mm,
want to remind people that there are a lot of diseases are that come from life choices. I mean, think about lung disease, heart disease, diabetes. All of these illnesses that are still illnesses come from life choices. There's an
right.
environmental factor to almost every illness. And there's also a genetic factor to it. So this is similar to all those other diseases. I think where people get really tripped up is that they are seeing people who are refusing to get help, or they're
And
seeing people who know that what they're doing is hurting others and they're continuing to do it. But the thing that I remind people of is that they're depending on the broken organ, right? Like the brain is the affected organ. The
I like
structure of the
that.
brain has changed because of this illness. So they're depending on that organ to help them make decisions about their treatment. And no other circumstance are we doing that unless we're talking about mental illness, right? So,
Mhm.
like I wouldn't it would be like if I broke my arm and you had me stand next to my twin sister and she doesn't have a broken arm and you said, "Now I want you to both throw this ball the exact same distance. Throw it as hard as you can, throw it the exact same distance." It would be for anybody watching, it'd be like, "That's insane. Her arm is
Right.
broken.
It's not
Why would you
happening.
have her try to throw it?" And that's what we're expecting from people with their broken or we're saying, "You need to make really good choices about this." And they're
Mhm.
like, that organ is affected. So that's not to say that we shouldn't set boundaries that would protect us from that person's illness. It just means that we can look at those things as symptoms of their illness. Their symptoms are behavioral because the brain is what is impacted.
That's so interesting. So would you even say to an extent, I've heard people say this, and I don't know what your thoughts are on it, but almost to kind of think of the disease when you're thinking of your loved one when they are sick, like it may not be them, it might be that part of the disease that you're seeing or talking to. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, I say that all the time when I'm talking to families is to, separate the person from the illness because then you can say, "Listen," let's say oh gosh, I don't wanna say somebody's name, Joe. Let's say my son is Joe, his name's Joe, and he's got an addiction. I might say, "Listen, Joe, I love you, and I care about you, but your illness seems to go with you everywhere you go." So I would separate that person from their illness. And then I can speak about their illness as if it's not them, because it's not, right? I love you, but every time you come over, your addiction is with you. Sometimes I've had families even name their loved one's addiction.
Mhm.
Um, I think I had a family name their, son's addiction the intruder, and so they would say, "Every
Ooh.
time you come over, the intruder's with you. We don't want your intruder. We want you, but this intruder keeps coming over, and we've gotta figure out a way to make sure that this doesn't happen. We don't want that in our house." So it took the personalization away, if that makes sense.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. Gosh, that almost makes me feel emotional just thinking about that because I know what I did to my family, and that it was a very intrusive thing. So that really hits home and is making me think a lot at a personal level. Okay, so while we're on that, they talk about addiction being a family disease, right? What does that mean?
Similar to other illnesses, it impacts the whole family, and, I'm gonna do another analogy because I love analogies.
Yeah,
I
no,
think
let's
we're
do it. I think it's
Yeah,
good for the viewers and listeners. It's simple and makes it relevant.
yes. I like simple, and I think we're dealing with a really abstract concept, and so if we can put it in material, like, kind of physical terms, it makes it easier to understand. Um,
Absolutely.
so a little background, family systems theory is a theory that's oftentimes studied. I studied it when I was getting my degree in social work. It basically says that we are all part of different systems, and one system that we're a part of is our family. And on a larger scale, or like our nation can be a system or whatever. So
Okay.
anytime um, no matter whether the system is healthy or unhealthy, the goal of any system is homeostasis or balance. So,
Okay.
no matter what, that system is always trying to achieve balance. It's usually subconscious. We see it in politics. I hate to bring up politics, but we see it.
Right.
Anytime
Right.
we see radical right, we see radical left. And so, the same thing happens in a family system. And so, if one person, the analogy is if a mobile above a crib. So, there's different strings that balance out this mobile. It can spin around and it stays balanced because the strings are balancing out each other's lengths. And
Mhm.
so a family is like that. If one person becomes sick with addiction, their gets cut short. And then all of a sudden we have that tilt in the mobile. And so the family immediately is going to shift around and people are going to change in order to balance out uh, the strings. So typically will see at least one family member become sick as well. And I don't mean necessarily by becoming an addict themselves, although that happens
Right.
regularly.
It does. No, this is a
Um,
good point of clarification too. That can and does happen, but yeah.
yes, but I'm typically, when I speak to families, it's more of they become unhealthy, and I don't mean that in a negative or derogatory term, I just mean from a perspective of, their life changes, typically their well-being changes for the worse because they try to overcompensate for that short string. So they have to shorten their string. So they're becoming sick too. And they don't realize it's happening because they're thinking, well, if I can save this person or fix this person, then our family will have balance again. They're maybe
Mm,
not thinking balance. They're thinking, I'm
right.
going to help save this person's life. And then everything else that happens within the family is basically just scrambling to try and make sure it stays balanced. So a lot of people can that's why it's called a family illness.
Yeah. Well, and I can see how a lot of families might wanna take that personal or not know how to receive that, right? They might think, "Oh, you're telling me I'm the reason that Johnny is an addict," or "I'm the reason that, Susie is struggling," right? And it's so hard to watch them struggle with that because no matter how much you try to explain, like, there was probably maybe nothing you could have done to stop this from happening because, as you said, there's a genetic component. What's harder to get them to see is that their response to Johnny or
Mhm.
Susie's behavior and their change in their posture towards that person that's struggling has shifted in an unhealthy way. And I love how you put that, right? That's so powerful. And I think it's really important for our listeners and viewers to understand. Pia Melody wrote a book about relationships, and I really enjoyed it. And it talked about how anytime you're in a relationship with somebody, if you acknowledge some things that you want to change, typically you have to be willing to change yourself. And when you change your dance posture with your dance partner, um, it can really throw them off. Whether they are consciously aware of it or not, it just throws them off. And I think
Yeah.
everybody knows this, right? I know this with certain types of little nuances of relationships with my family from when I changed from addiction to active recovery. It just throws that person off. And sometimes it's hard to even understand why you feel off, but the other person's acting differently and maybe different than they have acted. And I think it's little things like that that can just be a couple degrees off, but over the stretch of somebody's addiction, it turns those couple degrees turn into a large difference of how someone operates, you know?
The other sort of thing I was going to add to, and where it becomes, I think, a hard conversation to have with families is that their willingness to get treatment for themselves while the other person is in treatment also becomes pivotal. So just because it wasn't their fault that the family became sick doesn't mean that they don't have an individual responsibility to look at how they might be adding to the addiction cycle and potentially change some of the behaviors that may be keeping the family sick.
Yes.
Because to go along with that analogy, if I have a short string, I've got the addiction and I go off to treatment, I get better, I'm getting healthy, I'm finding recovery. My mom is already her string is short because she had to compensate for me, but my string's long again because I just went to treatment. I'm really healthy. I came back. Her string is still short. How that plays out when somebody gets back from treatment is that my mom may still have my location shared. And she may be watching it, and I may be going to a meeting. I'm going to a meeting, and I stop at Quick Trip on the way to the meeting. And she texts me and she says, "What are you in Quick Trip for? Thought you were going to a
Mhm.
meeting." And
Right.
immediately now I'm like, I'm gonna have to shift because
Yep.
she's still treating me like I'm still sick. So
Correct.
yeah, so it's really important for the family to get help when the
Absolutely.
addict
And
gets
just to
help.
clarify, when Suzanne says a meeting, so for most people that are unfamiliar with recovery, that could be like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, a faith-based AA meeting, Narcotics Anonymous, fill in the blank, the Smart Recovery, whatever, or Al-Anon. That's a really good point, and yeah, I think that you and, Maddie Prowicka, our family therapist, do a tremendous job of trying to prepare those families for what may come and what to try to work on themselves in, giving the benefit of the doubt and trusting that their loved one is going to be active in recovery, right? But, so you were kind of broaching on that. Let's get into what can they do or stop doing, right, in terms of that active addiction, and I think you were kind of alluding to some enabling behavior, which is again, admissions my team is very familiar with and tries to coach a little bit on the front end, but you are the master of that and the one who's helped us understand what that looks like, what that means. So talk to us a little bit about that. What does enabling look like? Is that a fuel to addiction?
Yeah, it absolutely is, and I think enabling that term in general is very stigmatizing because immediately it implies that I'm doing something wrong if I'm enabling somebody. And the reality is that it is impossible for family members not to enable, at least at the beginning, right? There are two different types of enabling. There's innocent enabling, and then there's desperate enabling. And the type that I referred to just a minute ago was desperate enabling. But what comes before that is innocent enabling. And that's before we know that there is an illness present, before we realize what we're dealing with. We might be doing things like paying their rent. We might be um, helping them out. Might start to, we might think we're being helpful and we might give them a little lecture, but we don't realize that it's the addiction. And then once we
Mm.
do, that's when desperate enabling kicks in. And I think when people think of desperate enabling, they think of like paying off their drug dealer. Like that's a pretty obvious, like bailing somebody out of jail.
Oh, yeah.
That feels pretty desperate enabling, right?
Right.
But the little ones that they don't realize might be um, giving them money for gas, which might actually be helping them to afford their drug habit.
I was actually
Or
gonna ask
maybe,
you a couple if that's okay, 'cause I hear
yeah,
a lot of this in the front end. So, what if they're like, "Well, yeah, we pay for Jimmy's car insurance." Is that an innocent enabling?
it depends what the motive is. So if the motive is, I am trying to keep my loved one from experiencing the discomfort of their illness, then I'm desperate enabling. Like if I am trying to protect them, that might be desperate enabling. Now, if I really think that I'm just paying their car insurance and it's not affecting their illness at
Mhm.
all, but if I'm doing it because, well, they have to have a car, because if they don't have a car, then they're not going to be able to get to their job. If they don't have a job, they're going to use more drugs.
So
That's
if
when
they're
I'm
as
trying to
desperate.
control it.
Gotcha. So once they're aware of the struggle and the inability to function
Mhm.
wholly, that is the turn to a desperate form of desperation driving that enabling. Because
Yes.
I see a lot of it on the front end where they're, I'll tell folks, well, hey, would a normal 20, 25-year-old be able to, manage a job, bills, be an independent person and pay for their own life? And typically the answer would be yes, right? And if not, I say, well, there may be a chance that you're passively kind of supplementing their income enough where there's a possibility for them to go spend that money that would have gone to car insurance or gas or food to drug addiction, right? Or alcohol or whatever. We know that it might feel passive, but it's like you and I both know there's a tremendous amount of supplementation that can happen there. I mean, young people that have addiction can be extremely resourceful and clever when needed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. They absolutely can. And I think deep down, families really believe that what they're doing is caring for their loved one. And so the the phrase that I like to use instead of enabling is caring out of balance. Because anything that we do that might be good, like caring for somebody, can be done out of balance. I can go to the gym too much and I can do that out of balance. I can eat healthy foods, but I can do that too much to the point where it becomes a disorder, right? So just like any of those, we can care out of balance. And that's what enabling typically becomes when we're dealing with an addiction.
Wow.
And families don't realize it because nobody ever tells us about this. Nobody
Correct.
wants to
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah.
And, people don't know how to respond if you share it. So families are often suffering in silence and just trying to figure it out on their own. So,
Mhm.
of course, we can't blame anybody for just trying to do their best.
Yeah, nobody got a handbook when they became a parent that said, "Hey, just in case your child becomes severely addicted to hard drugs." I mean, that's like a nightmare situation, and also I think I want to appreciate the complexities behind parenthood, right? I have
Um,
a daughter, a stepdaughter, and that relationship is different than a biological parenthood. However, I do think it's important to talk about the fact that being a parent is nobody was told how to do that. It's extremely difficult, right? And we're in a field that you hope would never happen to you or your child, right? Dealing with addiction or with something of that nature, mental health disorders. And I don't think anybody goes about it like wanting to not solve the problem. I think they're just doing the best they can with the tools that they were equipped with, right? There's a saying that, you're only as happy as your least happy child, something like that, which I come from a family of five and I have seen that at times when I was struggling with my own addiction and my parents were really focused on me. And I know that that caused some very painful emotional distress for my siblings. Like, well, why is Taylor always being focused on? What about us and our successes? Why haven't we been praised for how well we're doing? The attention, even though it's been negative, has been on Taylor. And so I can see how that has caused some dis-ease even further for my family. And again, after everything that you've said, thank you for all of those points. And I just want the listeners and viewers to know that in no way is this a judgment on families. It's a very difficult thing to navigate. There's no perfect way to do it, right?
Well, and I think too, it's really important, and I always tell families when I approach them, I am not going to handle the situation with kid gloves. I am going to tell you everything that you have been not necessarily wanting to hear, but needing to hear, because
Mhm.
most families are tough. They're dealing with one of the toughest illnesses that a family can go through. And so a lot of them really want answers. They want to hear the really hard truth of what needs to be done. And they've been relying on their instincts for so long that they're ready to, typically by the time I'm working with them, they're ready to like have somebody tell them, this is exactly what you do. This is exactly what
Yes.
you don't do, because they need some reassurance. It doesn't feel natural to say no to your child. It doesn't feel natural to
Right.
say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to figure out your housing situation on your own because I'm
Mhm.
not going to contribute to your addiction anymore. Like that
Right.
is probably one of the hardest things that you can
Ugh.
say as a parent.
Right.
And so they need somebody to say, listen, you have permission to say this, and it might even save your child's life.
Right. Yeah, we try to say in the admissions department, we're like, listen, we're not going to tell you how to parent or judge how you are parenting. What we will do is tell you what's effective and what's not effective, right? And that's about all we can do. But that kind of is going into the next piece for those families that have fallen onto the extreme side of trying to battle with their child's loved one's addiction. What does it mean when someone becomes enmeshed with their loved one's addiction? What does that look like?
Yeah, so typically you either see there's kind of a gradient, right? Some people do a really good job at detaching from the person who's struggling with the addiction, while others kind of more lean into that really enmeshed side, where the best way to describe it is they've jumped on the roller coaster with their loved one and they're riding it. Like their happiness is totally dependent on whether their loved one is doing okay or not. And so it's completely out of their control. One of my favorite phrases is, when I try to control what I can't control, I lose control of what I can control. And so families have really laser focused on, I need to get my loved one sober. And guess what? They have absolutely zero control over that. So now their well-being is completely dependent on this very sick person, and what they should be focusing on is setting boundaries and figuring out a way to detach with love. And
Mm.
people always say, well, if I'm detaching, it feels like I'm abandoning. And there's a very, very big difference between detachment and abandonment, right? It feels very similar in the moment, but I'm going to bring up another analogy.
Okay,
So,
let's hear it.
my favorite analogy of detaching with love is, if you and I were walking down the street and you fell into a 10-foot hole. You're right next to me, you're down in the hole. If I was enmeshed, right, with you, and I was like, his life is my life, I'm going to save it. I would jump into that hole with you, and then we'd both be stuck in a 10-foot hole together,
Mhm.
unable to get out.
Not good.
If I was just detached, if I was like writing you off, good luck, I would literally just leave you in the hole and I'd walk away. And some families have to go to that extreme in order to swing back to that detached with love kind of middle ground, right? Because we're doing the balance thing again. And so what somebody who is practicing detachment with love would do is they would tie a rope up, they'd go get some supplies, tie a rope up, throw it down, and they'd say, you know what? I love you. I support you. I'm going to be standing right here. Feel free to climb up whenever you're ready. And if they're taking too long, that person also has the right to say, you know what? I've got a dinner and you've got all the tools you need to climb out of that hole. I'm going to go to my dinner and I'll maybe come back and visit you in a little bit.
Mm.
Let me know if you need anything. So there's all sorts of things we can do to make sure that person doesn't feel abandoned, but that still protects myself. I'm not in the hole. I'm not taking up time that I can't take up. And I've given him tools.
Wow, I really like that. That's so good. Gosh, I can't wait to go talk to the admissions team and talk to them about that analogy and have them listen to this because, and again, we do that in so many different forms, but I love that. That's such a good one. And it probably can help ease some of the anxiety or guilt that a family may be feeling as they're starting to get their head around doing one of those, right? Like detaching with love or recognizing that they're carrying out of balance, because I think that might make them feel a little bit of guilt or shame. But boy, that is really awesome. So I imagine that detachment probably coincides with some boundary setting. Is that
Mhm.
is that something you would agree with?
Yes. Boundary setting is like the key to detachment. It really is. And a lot of people struggle with boundary setting. So having the right support when setting boundaries is so, so important because boundaries require consistency. And it's really hard to be consistent when our emotions are involved
Mhm.
because we're going to want to go with our emotions. Typically, when I see people doing a lot of enabling, it's really a coping mechanism to soothe their own anxiety. They might even see when they attempt to control their loved one's behavior, they might see a little bit of validation. For example, there might be a family who they say, if you're able to, stay sober for 30 days, I'll give you a car, right? That is not a
Mhm.
boundary. That is an attempt to control somebody. And so they are like, I can stay sober for 30 days. And by sober, they mean dry, right? So they don't use for 30 days and then they get that car. And now that loved one is thinking, I think I got this. I think I figured out how to control this disease. And really, what they did was they just muddied the waters a lot and
Right.
didn't achieve anything other than giving this person a car who's now using.
Correct. Really
So,
falsely motivated them, right? And let's go back, double click back into that. When you said they're remaining dry for 30 days, explain that. Explain that to a family. There's a lot of families out there
mm,
right now that may think that 30 days, give them the thing, the car, the shiny object, might still be a positive end point. Talk about that a little bit more.
yeah. Um, so the term dry is typically used for somebody who was able to remain abstinent or not using any sort of drug, but they didn't actually tap into the treatment of this illness. So, going back to the very beginning when we talked about this being an illness, similar to other chronic illnesses, this is a disease that is chronic, it's lifelong, and there is potential for treatment and remission, very long-term remission. We've seen a lot of people stay sober for a long time, but it requires treatment. And like other chronic illnesses, it requires regular treatment, even when there are no symptoms present. So, for somebody who is not bought in to treatment, they might be able to fake being well for 30 days or fake maybe not even fake it. Typically you can tell if somebody's not really bought in.
We have some bad attitudes from time to time, right? Just skating by.
Yeah, yeah, so it's really important that it is not I'm not motivated to go to treatment solely from my family pressuring me to. There's got to be some
Mm.
sort of internal motivation there. And the thing about internal motivation is it can be motivated by external things. If my life becomes so uncomfortable, I'm going to eventually want to get help, but it's going to require people around me to stop enabling me. People are going to have to stop making my landing softer because I'm going to need to feel it because that's my internal motivation. Not you telling me that you'll give me a car if I go to treatment, but you saying I'm no longer paying for your car. Get
Mhm.
treatment or don't get treatment. You're probably going to need a car at some point, and maybe you could buy one on your own if you were able to get some help. I mean, you'd say it nicer than that, but so there's the difference kind of between internal and external motivation, and I
And
think I
that's a
veered off.
That's a powerful I'm really glad you did, because that's a really powerful topic that, again, we talk about all the time, and I wanna tell, like, the listeners and viewers, admissions tries to take a little bit from medical and clinical and kind of compress it into a really short version of time with the individual struggling or the family and explain to them this in a short, quick fashion. It's important to understand those motivators, right? And that at the end of the day, what truly creates recovery is internal willingness, right? And you are, I mean, in my opinion, hit it spot on, right? And then sometimes there can be external motivators that can expedite the process, right? Like family members, I'll tell them there's ways that you can maybe not support them so much financially. You cannot, enable them so much, and that can make their world a little bit smaller and force them to a place of making a choice that they want to change a little bit sooner. However, it's not an ultimatum type of situation. It's just
Mhm.
this is what I'm going to do going forward. We don't feel good about giving you money now, knowing now that you are using drugs out of control, and we don't know what's going to happen next, and we don't feel comfortable giving you money. And in order to not feel held hostage emotionally by your addiction, we're not going to be giving you money anymore. And we hope that you do make a good decision to get into recovery at some point, but, you're certainly able to come back to us and talk to us if you need help finding options to explore recovery. But, yeah, I really loved what you said about the motivators, right? And those factors because it's very important to understand that. And not just from treatment, right? You're a member of personal recovery, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so too, with just people that you go to meetings with, seeing newcomers that show up to an AA meeting and seeing how they may still be getting some help or whatever. I mean, you see it everywhere. It's not just in treatment, right? You see individuals that are trying to find recovery, and some things might get in their way. Some things may be healthy boundaries that help support their way to
Yeah.
long-term recovery, right? Having said that, and I appreciate everything you said about, internal and external motivators. That's so, so, so handy. I can't express that enough. Just to, encourage our listeners and viewers to contemplate that, right? Think about how they're handling the situation, and if they're adding external motivators, or if they're helping their loved one find a way to internal motivation. I think that's awesome. But I think the last question I wanted to touch on, after we talked about the family, navigating all this, how to detach with love, how to recognize if they're carrying out of balance, right? Is where do children factor into all of this? How do we support and protect children?
Um, Modeling healthy behavior is always going to be the most helpful thing for a child. I think being able to educate children is also really important, rather than coming from a place of expecting that. I think a lot of people think that children don't know anything or aren't able to conceptualize what's going on. And the reality is that they can, and they will figure out what's going on in their own way. And a
Mhm.
lot of times it's not accurate. And so we have to sort of steer the narrative for them as children and help them to understand what a disease is, comparing it to other diseases that they can understand. Typically, they say around 6 is when children can start to understand very basic concepts of this illness. And right, we can talk to them about it because we're trying to take away the stigma, right? It's not like some scary topic that we don't talk about with our children. Like we have to talk about it with them.
Right.
Um, so educating them, modeling healthy boundaries, the going back to boundaries just a little bit, because I really would like to outline some of the guidelines for boundary setting because it's really important.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
let's hear it.
I Boundaries are oftentimes set with the intention of changing the person that the boundary is being set for. And we have to approach boundaries completely differently. So I always say, be consistent. Remember that this boundary is to protect you, right? Like it's like I put a lock on my door, and I don't put a lock on my door so that everybody else has to stay in certain areas of the world, right? I put a lock on my door so they can't come into my home without my permission, right? So, similar to that, boundaries are to protect me. So, if there are any different intentions with boundary setting, then I'm doing it for the wrong reasons, and it's not actually a boundary, it's an attempt to control somebody. And so, the other thing that people think is a boundary, which isn't, is a request. So they'll say, "Well, I told him to stop talking to me like that, so I set my boundary." And while it's nice and it's great to make a request of somebody, the boundary ultimately is the action that's going to back up that boundary, that's going to protect you when that other person doesn't. So
It
the request is, "Please don't talk to me like that." If they continue, then the boundary is, if you continue to talk to me like that, I'm going to leave the room. So I have an action
Mm.
that's going to protect me,
Hmm.
even if the other person continues to do what they're doing. If you show up to my house and I believe that you're intoxicated, I'm going to ask you to leave. If you don't leave, I'm going to call the police. So
Right.
being really direct, really firm, but also very loving. Again, going back to the intruder piece of this, right, is to say,
Right.
if you show up to my house and I feel like the intruder's here, I'm going to ask you to leave. So again, saying like, it's not that I don't want you here. I just don't want your addiction here with us. So
Right.
there's a lot of different, getting a therapist to help navigate all of those boundaries is extremely important. And
Mhm.
children will be watching that, and they will start to internalize what it looks like to have healthy boundaries. They really do.
That's awesome. I love it. And leading by example, right? Demonstration is one of the most powerful things that we can do for those around us. So, well, Suzanne, thank you so much for your time. I know all of our viewers are very grateful. We know you're a very busy person. You did not have to do this. For all of our viewers and listeners out there, as always, if you or a loved one are struggling, please do not hesitate to call. My team is available anytime, 816-597-1177. Midwest Recovery Centers would be happy to guide you and your loved one to whatever type of help they need, whether it's our services or not. Suzanne, thank you so much for your time and helping us navigate family recovery. Have a great day,
Thank you
everybody.
so much for having me.